Most people believe UFO reports were classified because someone was afraid the public might panic. That isn't true. Panic was never the concern. The real problem was recognition. Not recognition from the public, recognition from the people inside the system. My name is Richard J. Wolfe, former United States Air Force serviceman. I spent years inside programs that never appeared in public records, working around incidents that officially never happened. I wasn't a scientist. I wasn't an analyst. I wasn't someone invited into discussions. I was the kind of man the military prefers when something uncomfortable happens. Someone who follows orders. Someone who moves equipment, secures locations, signs papers, and forgets what he saw. For decades, that system worked exactly the way it was designed to. But there is one thing people misunderstand about classified incidents involving unidentified craft. The classification didn't start after investigations. It started before them, sometimes within minutes, sometimes before anyone on the ground even understood what they were looking at. And when something gets buried that quickly, it tells you something. It tells you someone already knows what it is. Or worse, they know what it might be. I learned that the hard way. It was late winter when I first realized how these situations were handled. I remember the cold more than anything else. Cold air that cuts through your uniform and sits in your bones. The call didn't come through the channels we normally used. It came through a restricted line that only rang when something had already gone wrong. No explanation, just coordinates. When you work long enough inside military structures, you learn to read the tone behind orders. That night, the tone was different. Not urgent in the usual way, controlled, tight, like everyone on the line was speaking around something they weren't allowed to say out loud. We deployed before sunrise. 2 vehicles, 6 men, no insignia visible on the transport documents. That alone was unusual. Every movement in the military is normally documented down to the last bolt. But that morning, the paperwork looked like it had been written after the fact. When we arrived, the perimeter was already secured, not by base security, by a unit none of us recognized. No patches, no names, different radios. They didn't greet us. They simply handed over new instructions. The first thing they took from us was our cameras. The second thing they took were our watches. People assume classification begins with documents. It doesn't. It begins with time. You remove timestamps, and events become harder to prove, harder to reconstruct, harder to question. At that point, none of us knew what we were about to see, but we understood something else. This wasn't a crash investigation. It was a containment procedure. And containment means one thing in military language. Someone has already decided the truth isn't leaving the site. We were led through a stretch of cleared terrain surrounded by portable floodlights. The ground looked disturbed, but not the way an aircraft accident usually does. No scattered debris field, no fire damage. Just a long scar in the earth, like something had touched the ground and then changed its mind. I remember the silence among the men walking with me. Soldiers talk when they're nervous, but that morning nobody said a word, because we all understood the rule without anyone needing to say it. If something didn't exist in official records, then seeing it didn't mean we were supposed to remember it. And that was the moment I began to understand why certain UFO incidents were classified so quickly. Not because they were mysterious, but because the people responsible for burying them had seen something like it before. And when you realize that, you start asking a different question. Not what happened here, but how many times has it already happened? I didn't know it yet, but that site was the first place where I would see something no report would ever describe accurately. Something that would explain why the classification order always came first and the investigation came second. But to understand that, you need to know what was waiting for us beyond those lights, and why the men already standing there looked less like investigators and more like witnesses who had been here before. There's a detail most people never think about when they imagine military responses to unidentified craft. If an event is truly unexpected, the response is chaotic. Different agencies argue over authority. Orders contradict each other. People improvise. That's how real surprises look. But what I saw that morning didn't look like improvisation. It looked rehearsed. The men who met us at the perimeter moved with the quiet efficiency of people following a checklist they already knew by heart. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody looked confused. They were calm in a way that only comes from familiarity. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Because if this was the first time something like this had happened, there wouldn't be a procedure waiting for it. And yet there was. We were divided into 2 teams. No explanation, no briefing, just assignments. 2 of us were instructed to assist with perimeter extension. The rest were taken toward the center of the site. I ended up in the second group. The floodlights made the entire clearing look like daylight, but the ground still held the darkness of early morning. The soil was torn open in a shallow trench stretching maybe 100 feet across the clearing. But there was no wreckage scattered around it. No wings, no broken fuselage, no smell of burned fuel. Aircraft accidents leave violence behind them. This place didn't look violent. It looked interrupted. Like something had touched the ground briefly and then lifted away again. That detail matters, because the official report that was later filed described the scene as impact damage consistent with a high-speed crash. But that's not what we were standing in. What we were standing in looked more like a landing attempt that went wrong. I remember one of the men beside me whispering under his breath, not a question, just a single word, "Where's the rest of it?" Nobody answered, because we were all starting to notice the same thing. The scar in the earth ended abruptly near the far side of the clearing, and that's where they had placed the lights. That's where the containment team was already working when we arrived. When we got closer, I could see something metallic lying partially embedded in the soil. Not large enough to be what people imagine when they think of flying saucers. Closer to the size of a small vehicle. But the shape didn't make sense. No visible seams, no rivets, no exposed framework. Just a curved surface reflecting the floodlights in a dull gray tone that almost seemed to absorb the light instead of reflecting it. I had spent enough time around aircraft to recognize familiar construction patterns. Panels, access ports, fasteners. Those things weren't there. The surface looked continuous, like it had grown that way rather than been assembled. One of the technicians was running a handheld instrument across the hull, moving slowly like someone listening for a signal only they understood. Another man was taking photographs using equipment none of us had seen before. Large camera housing, no flash, no audible shutter. Someone from the unidentified unit noticed us watching and stepped forward. "Observation only," he said quietly. That was all. Observation only. Not investigation, not documentation, just observation. We stood there for several minutes saying nothing while the containment team continued their work. And then something happened that still stays with me. One of the technicians knelt near an opening along the side of the object. At first I thought it was damage, a tear in the structure. But when the light shifted, I realized it was shaped too cleanly to be accidental. It was a hatch, partially open, just wide enough to reveal darkness inside. The technician leaned closer, shining a narrow inspection light into the interior. He didn't say anything, but the man beside him did something strange. He stepped back. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one slow step away, like someone instinctively giving space to something they didn't fully trust. That small movement changed the atmosphere around the site, because soldiers read body language faster than words. And when a trained technician takes a step back from an object he's examining, it means he has seen something he wasn't expecting. The officer supervising the operation approached them quietly. There was a short conversation I couldn't hear. Then the officer turned toward us. "Perimeter team," he said, "you're done here." No explanation, just dismissal. 2 men from the unidentified unit guided us back toward the outer lights. And that was it. No debrief, no documentation, no questions asked. Within an hour, we were back in the vehicles heading away from the site, carrying instructions to report to a secondary location for paperwork processing. On the surface, it looked routine, but I remember thinking about that hatch the entire drive. Not because I had seen what was inside. I hadn't. What stayed with me was something else. The reaction of the men who had. They weren't shocked. They weren't excited. They weren't confused. They looked resigned, like people who had hoped not to see something again and had just confirmed that it was back. That was the moment I realized something important about those highest level classifications. They weren't protecting the public from the unknown. They were protecting the system from confirmation. Confirmation that whatever we had found that morning was not the first time it had been recovered, and definitely not the last. But the part that still bothers me after all these years is what happened later that afternoon, because that's when the paperwork began. And when I read the official report they asked me to sign, I understood something about secrecy that most people never realize. Sometimes classified reports don't hide the truth. Sometimes they replace it. By the time we reached the secondary facility, the sun was already high. It was one of those places the military uses when something needs to exist temporarily but leave no trace afterward. A plain building on the edge of a base most people had never heard of. No signage, no unit designation outside, just a door, a guard, and a clipboard. Inside, the atmosphere was different from the site. Out there, everything had been quiet and deliberate. In here, it was administrative. Fluorescent lights, metal desks, stacks of folders already waiting. That alone told me something. Reports don't appear that fast unless someone has already decided what they're supposed to say. We were separated the moment we walked in. Standard practice, but in this case it felt less like procedure and more like containment of memory. 1 room, 1 chair, 1 table, and a man I had never seen before sitting across from me. He didn't introduce himself, didn't wear visible rank, but the way he carried himself made it clear he wasn't there to ask questions. He was there to make sure the answers matched something written down somewhere else. The folder in front of him already had my name on it. He slid a document across the table and tapped it once with his finger. "Read carefully," he said. I did. The report described an experimental reconnaissance platform that had suffered structural failure during a test flight. It mentioned debris impact patterns, fuel ignition risk, standard recovery operations. The language was clean, technical, and completely wrong. None of it matched what we had seen. Not the shape, not the condition of the ground, not the absence of wreckage, and definitely not the hatch. I looked up from the paper. For a moment I considered saying something, correcting the description, clarifying the details. That instinct lasts about 3 seconds when you're young in the military. Then training takes over. Because you learn quickly that some documents are written to record events, and others are written to define them. The man across from me must have seen the hesitation. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "You were part of perimeter support," he said calmly. He didn't approach the object directly. That wasn't phrased as a question. It was an instruction. I understood immediately. What we had seen that morning wasn't the problem. The problem was what would exist on paper afterward. And paper is what history remembers. I signed the document. So did the others. Each of us walked out with identical reports attached to our names. Officially, we had participated in a controlled recovery of damaged U.S. technology. Case closed before anyone outside that building even knew the incident had happened. But the process didn't end there. Before we were dismissed, another officer gathered the 6 of us in a small briefing room. No notes, no recording equipment, just words. He explained that the event we had assisted with was classified at the highest level available under existing security frameworks. He didn't mention extraterrestrials. He didn't mention unidentified craft. He didn't mention anything that sounded unusual at all. Instead, he said something far simpler. Certain materials recovered by the United States government require restricted handling protocols. That was it. One sentence. But then he added something I've never forgotten. If you encounter information in the future that appears inconsistent with today's documentation, you should assume the documentation is correct. Think about that for a moment. He wasn't telling us to forget what we saw. He was telling us that memory becomes irrelevant once the report exists. And that is the real power of classification. It doesn't just hide information. It redefines reality. When the meeting ended, we were released without further instruction. No follow-up interviews, no psychological evaluation, no additional paperwork. The system trusted something much stronger than threats or punishment. It trusted isolation. Because once you leave a room like that, you realize something uncomfortable. Everyone else who saw the same thing signed the same report, and none of you will ever compare notes. Years passed after that incident. Assignments changed, bases changed. Life moved forward the way it always does in the military. But every now and then, something would happen that reminded me of that morning. A radar track that vanished from official logs, a flight report that stopped mid-sentence, a conversation that ended abruptly when someone noticed who was standing nearby. Patterns, small ones, but enough to understand that what we had encountered wasn't a rare anomaly. It was part of something the system already knew how to handle. Which brings me to the part most people never hear about. The reason certain UFO incidents were classified immediately, sometimes before the debris even stopped moving. It wasn't because they were mysterious. And it wasn't because they were dangerous. It was because of what happened after the first few recoveries. Because once the government realized what some of those craft contained, the question stopped being what are they? The real question became something far more complicated. What happens if the world realizes we already have them? That question changes everything. And the answer to it explains why some of the men I met later in my career didn't look curious when new incidents happened. They looked tired, like people carrying knowledge they wished had never landed in their hands. But the truth behind that exhaustion didn't become clear to me until many years later. And when it did, I finally understood why certain files were sealed at the highest level the moment the call came in. Not because of what we might discover, but because of what had already been discovered long before I ever arrived at that clearing. And the worst part? Most of the people involved in those early recoveries never expected anyone outside the system to learn about them. Not in their lifetime. Not ever. Which makes the next part of this story difficult to explain. Because the moment that finally forced me to question everything I had signed didn't happen at a crash site. It happened during a quiet conversation many years later with a man who had been present at one of the recoveries that came before mine. And what he told me made that partially open hatch look very different in my memory. Years passed before I heard the part of the story that never appeared in any report. By then I had moved through several assignments, different bases, different responsibilities. Nothing that looked unusual from the outside, just another serviceman doing what he was told. That's how most of these things remain hidden, not through dramatic secrecy, but through ordinary careers. People imagine hidden programs as dark rooms filled with scientists and generals whispering over alien artifacts. In reality, the system is quieter than that. It's paperwork, transfers, unspoken understanding, and occasionally, a conversation that slips through the cracks. The one I'm about to describe happened late one evening in a maintenance hangar. Nothing special about the place. Just the kind of building where conversations echo because there's too much empty space above your head. The man I was speaking with was older than me by at least 20 years, a senior technician nearing the end of his service. I won't give his name, not because I'm protecting him. Most of the men who carried these memories are gone now, but because names were never the important part. What matters is what he had seen. The conversation started the way most military conversations do, small talk. Complaints about equipment, long hours, the usual things. Then something unusual happened. He mentioned a recovery operation from the early part of his career. Not in detail, just enough to recognize the pattern. Remote location, rapid deployment, restricted documentation. It sounded too familiar. So I asked him a simple question. Was it aircraft? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked across the hangar for a long moment, like someone measuring whether silence was still the safer choice. Then he said something I still remember word for word. It wasn't the first one. Not the first one. That sentence stayed in the air between us, because until that moment, I had always assumed something about the incident I witnessed. I assumed it was part of an emerging problem, something new the military was still learning how to handle. But his tone suggested something else entirely, something older. I asked him how long these recoveries had been happening. He shook his head slowly, longer than they told us. Then he said something even more unsettling. The procedures were already written when I got there. Think about that. When I arrived at that clearing years later, I noticed the containment teams moving like they were following a familiar script. Now I understood why. Because by the time my unit was sent to assist, the script had already existed for years, maybe decades. The older technician didn't go into dramatic detail about what he saw at his site. But he told me one thing that changed how I remembered the hatch we had found. He said the earliest recoveries had taught the government something important, something they hadn't expected. The craft themselves were only part of the problem. The real complication was what they sometimes contained. When he said that, I felt the same quiet tension I had felt standing near the floodlights years earlier. Not fear, not shock. Just the heavy awareness that certain knowledge changes how you see everything that came before it. I asked him what he meant. For a moment he didn't respond, then he said something very carefully. Sometimes they weren't empty. He didn't elaborate, didn't describe anything. And strangely, he didn't need to, because the way he said it told me everything I needed to understand. That hatch we had seen partially open, the technician stepping back from the inspection light, the officer ending our access to the site almost immediately afterward. Those weren't reactions to damaged equipment. They were reactions to possibility. Possibility that something had been inside, or maybe still was. The older technician eventually changed the subject, just like that. Conversation over. Years of silence returned to their usual place. But by then something had shifted in my understanding. I finally saw the classification system for what it really was. People think those files are sealed to protect the public, but after hearing that conversation, I realized the truth was much simpler. They were sealed because the government had already crossed a line it couldn't easily explain. Recovering technology is one thing. Nations do that all the time. But recovering vehicles that weren't built here, and possibly encountering the beings connected to them, that creates questions no official statement can safely answer. Questions like, how long has this been happening? Who really understands the technology? And perhaps the most uncomfortable one of all, if some of those recoveries involved living occupants, what exactly did we do with them? I never received answers to those questions. Most people inside the system didn't. Compartmentalization made sure of that. But the classification orders, the immediate lockdowns, the rewritten reports, those things start to make sense once you accept a single possibility. The government didn't classify those incidents because they were confused. They classified them because they weren't. And that realization leaves you with a question that still bothers me today. Not about what those craft were, but about the people who had been studying them long before men like me ever arrived at the scene. Because if the procedures were already written, if the reports were already prepared, if the secrecy was already perfected, then the real beginning of this story must have happened somewhere far earlier than any of the incidents the public has ever heard about. And sometimes I find myself wondering something I probably shouldn't. If those first recoveries happened decades before my time, who were the men standing under the floodlights back then, signing the first reports that replaced the truth? And more importantly, what did they see when they opened the hatch?